Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everyone that's here. I can't welcome people that aren't here, and this is going to be beginning of the presentation. My name is Bob Hesse, and joining me today is my co-researcher, Calixto Machado, and the subject is Transcendent Consciousness, Neural and Anatomical Correlates, Comparing the Memories of Near-Death and Mystical Experiences. It's a slightly different title than you saw before. Because it's changed since the announcement was put out. It'll be in 4 parts. Each part, background, objective research, and conclusions, will be broken up by an intermediate slide so you know we're making the transition. The background is just to get the terminology down. Near-death experience, NDE, is pretty well established as a term. We coined the term SCE, spiritual contemplative experience, which is synonymous with mystical experience. It's not quite the same as OBE, out-of-body experience, although SCE usually has OBE as part of it. We define that term to make a distinction between NDE and SCE, which happens separate from dying. And it relates to prayer. And all faiths share 2 different types of prayer: discursive, cataphatic, guided meditation, and contemplative, apophatic. And in the contemplative, there's the Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism, Christian mysticism, and centering prayer, which is what I'm involved with and which led to this research, is something I teach. It facilitates what's called contemplative prayer, and it can lead to an SCE experience. So giving you centering guidelines as to what centering prayer is. It's basically selecting a symbol of an image as a symbol of your desire to be with God. It could be a word. Then comfortably sitting for 20 minutes and introducing that word or symbol. And then every time we become aware of our thoughts or become aware we're engaged with our thoughts, we very gently return to our sacred image or word. Essentially, we're saying we'd rather be with you, God, than with even our own thoughts. And then we have a gentle readjustment. Now, I told you this here because when we talk about the research, you'll know what the subjects went through and how we got to the point we did. The research was conceived by the fact that when I was, I've been teaching centering prayer to thousands, and I learned it at a Trappist monastery. And at the last minute, I threw in intuitive and analytic because of the keynote speech that was given. The unconscious unloading to the conscious is something that I have observed quite often. And it's analogous, the unconscious is analogous to an iceberg. Most of it's below the conscious brain. And I was teaching centering prayer to a group of 10 people, and 3 of them, after the very first 20 minutes sit, started to tell me that they had relived their near-death experience. This stuck with me, and I must tell you, I was stunned. And only when I met Calixto Machado at a Disorders of Consciousness conference that he sponsors, and he actually discovered a new state of unconsciousness, that he's one of the world's experts at bringing people out of comatose states. And so it dawned on me that there's a connection between the 2. And here I had an expert that knew how to do it, or I had been exposed to it in his cases. And then during a conference, his daughter experienced a spiritual contemplative experience at a conference. And that was her first time. And so that inspired me to ask Calixto, have you had many patients tell you about near-death experiences? And he said, oh, yes, all the time. So that led to research. And the research needed both NDE and SCE subjects. And as it turns out, Father Walker, whom I know, and Calixto knows, he was the one that taught it. And he is one of the few that would, in that area, that would be able to identify people who have had these spiritual contemplative experiences. Identifying people that have had near-death experiences is easier than spiritual contemplative. The objective of the study was to compare the 4 attributes that are similar between the 2: paranormal, out of body, a spaceless sense of ecstasy, cognitive timelessness, The prayer seems to be very short when it's actually rather long. They both have an effective sense of peace, a wholeness, a perfection, and they have a transcendent divine spiritual element to them, a oneness, if you will, which this symbol is meant to describe. This is happens to all the faiths. It's not just Christianity. And so they have four similar attributes, and a Greyson scale that science has used to describe those states show that they do. The motivations for the research was that about 87% of the population believes in transcendence to next life. Interfaiths have described SCE and NDE for centuries. There are conferences that have been going on to describe them, and there's not much cross-fertilization. Medicine has debated the bioethics of defining death. People have reported reliving of NDE as SCE, which I actually directly experienced. And neuroscientists seek consciousness neurocorrelates, and science recognizes similar NDE and SCE attributes through the Greyson scale. The objective was to compare the neural and anatomical correlates of remembering SCE and NDE. This was a unique comparison. As far as we know, it's never been done before in that way. And the results were hopefully going to shed light on the motivations for the study. Now, the committed researchers were numerous. Harold Koenig was involved in the beginning. He really helped and gave guidance. And Andrew Newberg did scientific scans of Franciscan nuns doing sedentary prayer. So we're going to move to the research. The protocol was study subjects, 5 ND and 5 SE confirmed by the Greyson scale. A neurological exam was done to CAT and MRI to eliminate subjects with brain damage. There was a resting state established for the baseline. Guided meditation is standardized to facilitate remembering the ND and SE. So we're introducing it and then letting them remember during a 7-minute period. And I was hard to convince, but Calixto convinced me, because he's the neuroscientist, that remembering is an acceptable way of trying to study the actual state itself, because you can't catch people in the act of either one of these. And during that period is when we did the research. There were, as I said, 10 subjects. I'm not going to get into this, but obviously the NDE died of something. The SCE, this happens spontaneously. And it happens quite often when we teach the centering prayer. That's been my experience. We did the research in 3 phases: a snapshot neural picture with quantitative EEG, and I'm going to get into each of these more in detail, then a continuous neural, and then a continuous anatomic assessment. Choosing the tool was the challenge. You want a spatial and temporal accuracy. In other words, where did it happen and when did it happen? These 3 are very good on spatial, but not too good on temporal. These are pretty good on temporal, not good on spatial. These are not very good on either, but they fall in the curve. Calixto chose QEEG, quantitative electroencephalogram tomography, using the Loretta method for the interpretation. And he gained this experience through his experience with bringing people out of comatose states. I won't go through all of the frequencies, but I'll just give you one. We did it at the alpha frequency and use a baseline. And when they were remembering their NDE, there was definitely activity. And when they were remembering their SCE, there was the same kind of increase in activity. So there was definitely a correlation, but SCE was much greater. And that was true of all the frequencies we studied. The second level was a continuous neural, and that was across many different cases, but I just chose one here, and that was the different hemispheres. And you can see during the period of time of the remembering, the activity was very similar and in the separate hemispheres, but again, it seemed greater for the SCE. And then finally, I got to look at my time here. The continuous anatomical is something that we studied, and the parameters were really heart rate and heart rate variability, and the variability is a variation in time intervals between consecutive heartbeats, and then the methods used for standard deviation of the mean normal to normal intervals and the mean square of the successive differences, which is a way of evaluating this. Now, here's something that occurred in our study that we are not surprised at, but a little bit we were. The SCE was always peaceful, and the heart rate went down, and these two evaluations show that they went up, which we would have expected under a very peaceful state. And this was very similar to the peaceful NDE. And we had two subjects that had peaceful NDE. But there were three subjects that had anxious NDE experiences. Now, this is written up in the literature, but we caught it in the anatomical. And there was no correlation with SCE for these three patients in the anatomical. What were our conclusions? Well, bear with me here. I don't know how much time I have left here. Let me see, 31, I'm running close. Preliminary conclusions were the QEEG and CEEG neural correlations between the two across many frequencies and the Greyson scale confirmed that there was a correlation between those two experiences. The CAA emotional correlation also showed that correlation, but in both cases, it was greater than the SC. The ESC was greater, which would make sense because they were not remembering a painful state of dying. In phases 1 and 3, the Greyson scale changed, which was really a surprise to us. Its results perhaps were explainable by the conflicting NDE memories between the painful dying process and the pain-free out-of-body that they experienced afterwards and then came back. And this is actually written up in the literature. We recognize the limitations of the study, remembering not necessarily the same event as actual event. The control state was remembering nothing. They were just resting. Perhaps we should have had them remembering peeling a banana or something. And the small number of subjects was, of course, the biggest limitation. Path forward, let me see what time I had, 20:32. Preliminary conclusions encourage expanded use for the subjects. In other words, this was a preliminary study, and what it showed us is that we have to have more subjects because there's promise here that there's more to learn. The QEEG tool was very useful compared to most people's tools that are using for this. Very applicable to palliative care. We could teach centering prayer to people that are dying. And I've done this interfaith because it's a form of prayer that's silent. So in the silence, there's no dogma. And so teaching this to people that are in the palliative care would help lessen their fear of dying. And the collaborative research is really necessary to do this. It's not just faith and science. It's not just medicine, it's also faith. And very, very spot on to the theme of this whole conference, and that is how they're coming together. I think they're coming together in consciousness. That's where it's headed. Transcendent events, just to summarize, Moody described the NDE in 75, James in 1902, and Einstein talked about the singularity. I got to tell you, I just happened to notice this one day. The singularity at the beginning of the Big Bang has similar attributes. I'm not suggesting they're the same, but this spaceless singularity is no material presence, timeless. There's no time at the singularity. There was no light. Effective wholeness, singularity was zero entropy, and transcendence and oneness with the universe and the unified four forces. All of these singularity were from Einstein. So, in conclusion, there is a oneness to creation, and I think that's driving home the message of this conference, that we have to start looking at these things together and see the common attributes and study where these transcendent states are between this life and the next, and do them from a scientific standpoint. I would suggest now that if you have any questions, I will take those questions, and if you have any questions for Calixto Machado, we can have those taken too. Let me go. Why can't we show our face name? We should like to see all the learners. I don't know what that was probably before this got started. I received a message stating the host disabled video. Well, So did you ever see the video? Or did anybody see the videos? Raise their hand. The PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so I guess it worked. So that was all. Okay, so any questions, basically? You have to unmute yourself if you're going to ask a question or whatever you do. However we do that, I don't know. You're saying NDE and SCE are similar experiences. John Graham asked that question. Basically, I'm saying that they are similar attributes. They have similar attributes, and in a religious sense, you would expect them to have similar attributes because they're on that transcendent point. But whether they scientifically do, that was our attempt to try to show that, to see if there were scientifically any correlations. And there were hints that there were. And a question, I am curious why an NDE surfaces during centering prayer. Your friend, this is lifting the UCS to the CS, conscious state, yeah. But I wonder about what seems to be the vividness. My experience of centering prayer is more of a knowing than memory recall. What do you think is occurring? I think what's happening, and I've seen this in PTSD patients, they have a memory that's in their unconscious, and they're not completely recalling it. And when you get rid of the ruminations of your conscious brain during centering prayer, it leaves room for the unconscious to unload. And I've seen that in PTSD patients. I think the same thing happened to those 10 people that I taught. 3 of them started to talk about their near-death experiences after their first 20-minute set. And I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. I've never seen it. I had never seen anything like that. And it was all intimate memory. Centering prayer requires a complete lack of thought awareness. How did you control for this? That is guaranteed that these subjects had reached that state. Actually, that's not quite accurate. It's not a complete lack of thought awareness. It's actually a very clear thought of awareness of thought. It's what you do with the thoughts that's the key. So that every time you become aware of your thoughts or become aware you're engaging them, you gently let them go and return to your sacred word. And if you do it 1 time or 1,000 in 20 minutes, it doesn't matter. So it's a processing of the thoughts. It's not making your brain erased. That's impossible. We're all human. Okay, so any others? So you think the NDE is encoding in memory similarity to a traumatic experience? Yes. I'm not saying it's traumatic. I'm saying that when there's something that's memorable, either traumatic or joyful or not joyful, it can quite often, the real memory of it can be in the unconscious. You don't always recall it as much, and certainly not as vividly. So this whole concept of faith, for example, I think with a small f, quite a bit is in the unconscious. It's been shown that we can learn in the unconscious. There are many examples of that, in which case that would be what the keynote speaker was talking about in different words, okay? In other words, the intuitive is in a sense a learning of in the unconscious. And when that unloads to the conscious, then you can analytically study it more. That's what was happening, I think. If I may continue, is someone in the midst of the NDE in a conscious state? I can tell you that when we were asking them to remember it, when they were being scanned, they were certainly in a conscious state and remembering it. But the problem with this research is you can't catch people in the act. And so it's never going to be the same as the actual event.